Representing the Ukraine, Anastasia Nedabiga and Victoria Keza. Representing Canada, Jennifer Abel and Pamela Ware. Representing Mexico, Paula Espinoza and Dolores Hernandez. Representing Great Britain, Rebecca Gallantry and Alicia Blagg. Representing Australia, Madison Keeney and Annabelle Smith. And representing China, Wu Mingjia and Shi Tingmiao. So presenting our divers here in the final of the women's 3-metre synchronized springboard at the FINA NBC Diving World Series Dubai 2015. So here we go, competition about to commence here in the final of the women's 3-metre synchronized springboard. The team represented Ukraine for their first dive, 201B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7, 7.5, 8, 8. Synchronization, 8, 8.5, 8, 8.5, 8.5. Next up, the team representing Canada will be performing a 401B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 8, 8, 8. Synchronization, 8.5, 8, 8, 8, 8.5. Next on the boards, the team representing Mexico will be performing a 101B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 8, 8.5, 8, 7.5. For synchronization, 8.5, 8.5, 8, 8.5, 8.5. Next up, the team representing Great Britain, performing a 401B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 8, 7, 8, 8. Synchronization, 8 across the board. Next up, the team representing Australia will be performing a 201B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 6.5, 7.5, 7. Synchronization, 8, 8.5, 8, 8, 8. team representing China will be performing a 101B, degree of difficulty 2.
Judges' scores for execution, 8.5, 9, 9, 9. For synchronization, 9.5, 9.5, 9, 9, 9. Round number 2, women's 3-meter synchronized springboard. Team from Ukraine will be performing a 301B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7, 7, 7.5, 7.5. Synchronization, 7.5, 8, 8, 7.5, 8.5. Team from Canada performing a 301B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 8.5, 7.5, 8. For synchronization, 8.5, 8, 8.5, 8, 8.5. Team from Mexico will be performing a 301B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 8, 8, 8, 7.5. Synchronization, 8, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5. Next, the team representing Great Britain will be performing a 301B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 7.5, 8.5, 9. For synchronization, 8, 8, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5. Next up, the team from Australia will be performing a 301B, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 8, 7, 6.5. For synchronization, 7.5, 7, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5. Team from China will be performing a 5-3-3-1D, degree of difficulty 2. Judges' scores for execution, 8.5, 8.5, 8, 8.5. Synchronization, 9, 9, 8.5, 8.5, 9. To round number 3, team representing Ukraine, performing a 405B, group difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 6.5, 6.5, 8, 7.5. For synchronization, 7, 8, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5. The team from Canada will be performing a 205B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 8, 8, 7.5, 8. Synchronization, 8.5, 8.5, 9, 8.5, 8.5. Team representing Mexico will be performing a 205B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 5, 6, 7, 6.5. For synchronization, 7, 7.5, 7.5, 7, 7.5. Team representing Great Britain. Scores for execution, 7, 6.5, 8, 8.5. Synchronization, 7.5, 7.5, 8, 7.5, 7.5. The team from Australia will be performing a 405B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 7, 8, 8, 8. Synchronization, 8, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5, 8. The team representing China will also be performing a 405B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 8.5, 8, 9, 8.5. Synchronization, 9, 8.5, 9, 9, 9. Moving on to round number 4. from Ukraine will be performing a 5-1-5-2B, group difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 7, 7.5, 7. For synchronization, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 8, 7.5. Next up, the team representing Canada will be performing a 107B, group difficulty 3.1. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 7, 7.5, 8.5. Synchronization, 8, 8, 8, 7.5, 7. Team representing Mexico will be performing a 5-1-5-2B, group difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 7.5, 8, 7. Synchronization, 8, 7.5, 8, 8, 8. Team from Great Britain will be performing a 205B, group difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 6.5, 7.5, 7, 8. Synchronization, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5, 8. Next up, the team representing Australia will be performing a 107B, group difficulty 3.1. Judges' scores for execution, 6, 6, 8, 8. Synchronization, 7, 6.5, 7, 7, 7.5. The team representing China will be performing a 305B, group difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 9, 7.5, 8. For synchronization, 8, 8, 8, 8, 8.5. Just one round remaining now, the fifth and final round. Overall ranking, China leading at the moment, of Canada, Great Britain and Mexico really tight. Here we go, the final dive here. Women's 3 metre Synchro Springboard competition.
team from Ukraine will be performing a 107B, degree of difficulty 3.1.
Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 7, 7, 7. For synchronization, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, 7. For their final dive, the team representing Canada will be performing a 5.1, 5.2B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 8, 8, 7.5, 8. For synchronization, 8s across the board. The team representing Mexico will be performing a 4.05B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5 across the board. Great judging. Synchronization, 8, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5, 7.5. Their final dive, the team representing Great Britain will be performing a 107B, degree of difficulty 3.1. Judges' scores for execution, 6.5, 6.5, 7, 6.5. Synchronization, 7.5, 7, 7.5, 7, 7. Next up, the team representing Australia will be performing a 5.1, 5.2B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 7.5, 8, 8, 8. Synchronization, 8, 7.5, 8, 8, 8. And final dive here, representing China, forming a 2.05B, degree of difficulty 3. Judges' scores for execution, 9, 8.5, 9, 9. Synchronization, 9.5, 9, 9, 9, 9. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our final here in the women's 3-metre synchronized springboard. And it will be gold to China. That total score of 338.10. Fantastic final dive, saving their best for last as well. Beautifully executed. Back 2.5 somersault. Will be Canada finishing with the silver. See Jennifer Abel and Pamela Ware there. 315.51. Mexico, Carla Espinoza, Boris Hernandez, rounding out the podium, place getters, 303.90. Once again, China keeps their winning ways going here. 3 from 3 here at our FINA NBC Diving World Series in Dubai for 2015. Big congratulations to Wu Mingxia and Chi Miao.